There comes a moment when you finally see it clearly, not as confusion, not as pain, but as truth. You stop waiting, you stop reacting, and something inside you quietly returns to itself in a way you can never unfeel again. There is a quiet turning point that almost no one notices when it happens. Something inside you changes so subtly that it doesn't feel like a decision at all. You stop waiting for the apology that was never coming. You stop going over old conversations in your head, trying to find the exact moment things went wrong. You stop asking why they treated you that way. And then, without any big reaction or emotional scene, you just stop caring. Not because you are defeated, not because you are empty, but because something in you finally becomes clear. You see it for what it is, and that is the moment that hits them the hardest. It is not your anger that shakes them. It is not your sadness. It is not even you walking away. What unsettles them at the deepest level is your indifference. Because indifference means they no longer have access to you. And for someone who depended on your emotional reactions, that feels like losing control completely. If you have ever been around someone who needed to shape your emotions, someone who became cold when you were no longer chasing their approval, someone who could not tolerate you being happy without them, then this message is for you. Because understanding this changes how you see everything, including yourself. Before going further, if something in this kind of psychological awareness speaks to you, stay connected with the healing empath. This space is for the kind of truths most people avoid, but many deeply need. Let's continue. To understand why your emotional distance affects them so strongly, you have to understand what they were actually relying on. It was never real love. Love is stable, calm, and giving. What they depended on was your reaction, your attention, your emotional response, your need for their approval, your confusion, your attempts to fix what kept breaking. Every time you showed pain, they felt important. Every time you asked for clarity, they felt in control. Every time you reacted with anger or tears, it gave them proof that they still had influence over your inner world. Your emotions became the space where they felt powerful. And this is the difficult truth to accept. You were pulled into a dynamic where your emotional energy was being used as fuel. The push and pull, the warmth followed by distance, the affection followed by silence, it was all part of a cycle that kept you engaged, kept you questioning, kept you emotionally tied. Because their sense of identity is not fully built from within, it depends heavily on external reflection. They feel real when someone reacts to them. They feel valuable when someone chases them. They feel significant when they can disrupt someone's emotions. In a way, you became that reflection, the mirror they used to confirm their own importance. And then something shifted in you. Maybe it happened slowly after repeated moments of being dismissed, confused, or emotionally worn down. Or maybe it happened suddenly after one final moment that crossed a line inside you. But either way, your emotional attachment began to fade. The constant overthinking started to quiet. The urge to understand them started to lose strength. The need to fix things started to disappear. And slowly, your life started returning to you. You began to sleep better. You started smiling without forcing it. You started imagining a future that didn't revolve around them. And without realizing it, you became harder to reach emotionally. On their side, this is where confusion begins. At first, they don't fully register the change, or they refuse to. Because in their internal view, you are not someone who simply lets go. They are used to the idea that your attention will always return, no matter what happens. But this time, something is different. So when your energy starts to shift, when your replies become shorter, when that emotional urgency in your voice starts to fade, their first reaction is not fear. It is dismissal. They convince themselves you are just reacting, that you are trying to teach them a lesson, that this is another emotional strategy to pull their attention back. In their mind, if they wait long enough or stay distant enough, you will eventually break and return the way you used to. So they wait, they observe, and for a while they feel safe in that assumption. They believe nothing has truly changed. But then time keeps passing, and you don't break. You don't send the first message. You don't check on them. You don't search for them online. You don't create excuses to re-enter their space. You simply continue living a life that no longer revolves around them. And something uncomfortable starts to rise inside them. At first it is subtle, almost hard to name, but it slowly turns into a realization they don't want to accept. This might actually be different. This is the beginning of what can be described as narcissistic panic. Not loud anger yet, not obvious manipulation yet. Something quieter, more unsettling. A deep internal discomfort, like the ground beneath their certainty is no longer stable. Because the reflection they used to depend on is no longer responding. Without your reactions, they lose the sense of who they are. It is like looking into a mirror that suddenly goes blank. What happens next becomes very predictable once you understand it. They test the connection. A message appears out of nowhere. Something casual. Something that feels harmless on the surface. A memory they suddenly remembered. A random check-in sent at a carefully chosen time. But this is not about missing you in a real emotional way. This is about checking access. They are testing if they still have a way into your emotional world. They are not trying to rebuild something at this point. They are trying to confirm they still can. If you respond warmly, even slightly, there is immediate relief on their side. Not because of love, but because the connection feels active again. The mirror is working again. Their internal tension drops. But they don't truly reconnect. They retreat again soon after, temporarily satisfied, until the cycle begins again. However, if you respond with neutrality, or if you don't respond at all, something deeper gets triggered. Now it is no longer simple discomfort. It becomes destabilizing because your silence is not being interpreted as a tactic anymore. It is being understood on some level as independence, as distance that is not emotional reaction, but emotional separation. And that is something their mind struggles to process. You are no longer orbiting them. You are no longer reacting to them. You are no longer emotionally reachable in the way they are used to. And to them, that does not feel like rejection in the normal sense. It feels like loss of control over something they assumed was always available. This is where things intensify. Because they do not respond well to emotional silence that they cannot influence. So their behavior often shifts in ways that can feel confusing if you don't understand the pattern. The same person who ignored you, dismissed you, or made you feel replaceable can suddenly become present again, more attentive, more visible. Sometimes even seemingly thoughtful or vulnerable. They may reach out more often. They may appear in places you are likely to be. They may bring up shared memories. They may even try to look emotionally open. But underneath it all, the goal is not genuine connection. The goal is to reestablish emotional access. At the same time, they may start shaping a story through others. They might tell mutual friends or people around you that they are concerned, that you seem different, that they hope you are okay. On the surface, it looks caring, but underneath, it builds a narrative where they appear as the concerned one and you appear distant or unstable. It quietly shifts perception without direct confrontation. And when they cannot reach you directly, they may try to reach you indirectly through conversations, through shared contacts, through subtle suggestions meant to make you question yourself or feel the need to respond. Because the moment you react again, even out of frustration, the emotional connection is reactivated. The cycle starts again. The attention returns. That is why staying centered becomes so important here. Not engaging does not mean you are cold. It means you are no longer available for patterns that drain you. This is the part most people struggle with because the urge to defend yourself is natural. When someone misrepresents you or tries to provoke you, your instinct is to respond, to clarify, to correct. But in this dynamic, reacting is exactly what keeps the loop alive. What breaks it is not anger, not explanation, not proving your point. It is distance that stays consistent, a quiet refusal to re-enter the emotional cycle. And that is where real change begins, because in that space, you start returning to yourself in a way that no longer depends on their reaction at all. But you need to understand what is actually happening beneath that urge to explain yourself, to defend your story, to make others see the truth. Every time that impulse rises, it is not new. It is not random. It is an old emotional conditioning being activated again. A response that was shaped over time in a dynamic where your emotional energy was constantly pulled out of you. The sense that you must respond, that you must clarify, that silence somehow means you are at fault. But silence is not guilt. Silence simply means you are no longer participating. It means you have stepped out of a system that required your reaction to function. And the hardest thing for the other side to accept is not your anger or your explanation, but your absence from the emotional exchange entirely. Now go deeper into what happens on their side, because there is a psychological shift here that most people never fully understand. When a narcissistic structure loses access to your emotional reactions, the experience is not the same as ordinary loss. It is not processed as simple sadness or separation. It becomes something far more destabilizing, often described in psychology as a form of narcissistic injury. Not just disappointment, but a disruption in the foundation of how they see themselves. Because their identity is not internally anchored in a stable sense of self, it is built outwardly through reflection, through being seen as important, through being emotionally significant to others, through provoking reactions that confirm in their mind that they matter. So when you stop reacting, something in that structure begins to fail. The belief that they are central to your emotional world no longer holds, and with that, the internal system they rely on to feel real starts to fracture. What emerges underneath that fracture is not simple sadness. It is a deep psychological alarm, a fear that is difficult to articulate consciously. Not just fear of losing you, but fear of losing the role they occupied inside your emotional world. Because without that role, their sense of significance destabilizes. And when that internal instability reaches a peak, it often converts into something else entirely. Rage. This is the third wave, and it can express itself in different ways depending on the person. Some shift into control and retaliation. They try to regain influence through indirect pressure. Smear narratives begin to spread. Distorted versions of events are shared with others. Situations are reframed in ways that cast them as misunderstood and you as the problem. Any remaining leverage, shared history, social circles, responsibilities, may be used as pressure points to force engagement. Because even conflict still means connection. Even anger still means access. Others move into emotional collapse. They present themselves as hurt, overwhelmed, or deeply affected. Messages may suddenly become vulnerable, expressive, even self-blaming. But underneath that emotional display is often the same objective: to reopen the channel, to pull you back into the role where your attention and emotional response become available again. Sometimes these two patterns alternate: punishment, then vulnerability; distance, then sudden closeness. Not because of clarity, but because different strategies are being tested to see what still works. What they are ultimately searching for is simple: the part of you that still reacts. Because reaction is access. Reaction is engagement. Reaction is the proof, in their internal system, that they still exist in your emotional space. But when there is no reaction left, no anger, no pleading, no explanation, no emotional charge, something different happens. A limit is reached that their system cannot easily adapt to. And this is where everything begins to shift. Because true emotional detachment is not perceived as neutral. It is perceived as loss of control over something that was assumed to be available. At that point, what you are witnessing is not just behavior aimed at regaining attention. It is a collapse of expectation. And this is where your growth matters most, because what breaks this cycle is not a better explanation, not a stronger argument, not even emotional closure. It is non-participation. Not as punishment, not as strategy, but as a state of being where their emotional pull no longer organizes your internal world. And this is where something very important becomes clear. Healing is not just personal. It changes the structure of the dynamic itself. Because every time someone steps out of a system where their worth is defined by another person's emotional response, that system loses power. The belief that you need their approval weakens. The belief that their reaction defines you weakens. And what takes its place is something much more stable: a return to internal ownership of your emotional life. You begin to understand that peace is not something granted by someone else's behavior. It is something you live in independently of it. That shift is what makes you, in the deepest psychological sense, unreachable in the old way. And once that point is reached, the dynamic cannot function the same anymore, because it depended entirely on your emotional availability. What remains is not hatred, not revenge, not even resistance. What remains is distance that no longer needs justification. And that is where real separation finally happens, not in conflict, but in quiet internal release, where your attention no longer returns to what once consumed it. But what they are actually experiencing is not love for you. It is panic about themselves. It is the fear of an empty internal mirror, the discomfort of facing a self that no longer feels solid without external validation. And that is not something you were ever responsible for fixing. You were never meant to hold that weight. You cannot love someone into wholeness when they are using your love as a replacement for doing the inner work themselves. You cannot sacrifice your own emotional health just to stabilize someone else's avoidance. And realizing that deeply, not just intellectually, but in a grounded, lived way, is not cruelty. It is clarity. In fact, it is one of the most compassionate realizations you can reach for yourself. And in an indirect way, it is the only stance that removes you from enabling a cycle that keeps both people stuck. Because when you stop participating in it, you stop feeding the pattern. And without that reinforcement, the dynamic can no longer continue in the same way. Some people will never fully face that reflection. They will move on to new sources of attention, new emotional environments, new people who temporarily hold up that external sense of self. And those people may go through their own version of what you went through. But that is no longer your responsibility. You have already lived through that chapter. You have already paid the emotional cost of it. And in a very real sense, you have already grown beyond it. And this is what that growth begins to look like in real life. It looks like waking up on a regular morning and realizing they are not the first thought in your mind anymore. It looks like having conversations where you are fully present, not half distracted by old emotional echoes. It looks like making choices based on your own preferences, your own values, your own direction, without that constant background awareness of how someone else might judge or respond. It looks like silence that no longer feels heavy. It looks like solitude that feels stable instead of empty. It looks like slowly, quietly returning to yourself. Because you are not the same person who entered that experience. You cannot be. What you went through shaped you, stretched you, and revealed parts of you that may never have surfaced otherwise. Your boundaries are clearer now. Your awareness is sharper. Your ability to sense emotional dynamics is deeper than it used to be. None of that should be minimized. And here is the truth that ties everything together. The moment you genuinely stopped caring about their opinion of you, you did not lose anything meaningful. You did not fail at anything. You did not become cold or detached in a negative sense. You simply took your emotional authority back. You stopped outsourcing your sense of worth to someone who was never qualified to define it in the first place. Your feelings belong to you again. Your peace belongs to you again. Your story no longer needs permission from anyone else to be valid. And what they are left with is not your absence in a dramatic sense, but the absence of the role they once relied on you to play in their emotional world. Meanwhile, you are no longer inside that structure. You are outside of it, seeing clearly again, remembering yourself without distortion, without fear, without constant emotional negotiation. That realization is not small. It is the turning point, because it means you are no longer surviving the dynamic. You have stepped out of it. And from here, life begins to feel different in a very quiet but undeniable way. Not because everything becomes perfect, but because you are finally present in it again. That is the real shift. Not revenge, not closure, just return. What they are left with is not love for you. It is not real connection either. It is the discomfort of losing the emotional reflection they depended on to feel stable inside themselves. And that is not something you were ever meant to carry or repair. You were never responsible for holding together a version of someone that only existed through your reactions. You cannot build someone's wholeness for them while losing your own in the process. And you cannot keep sacrificing your peace just to manage someone else's emotional instability. Realizing this clearly is not bitterness, it is awareness. It is the point where confusion finally ends and truth becomes simple. Because you are not who you were when you first entered that experience. You have seen things, learned things, and felt things that changed how you understand people and yourself. That awareness does not disappear. It becomes part of your discernment, part of your strength, part of how you move differently now. And this is the real ending of that chapter. Not closure from them, not an apology, not an explanation that finally makes everything make sense, but something quieter and far more powerful. You stop needing any of that to be free. You stop waiting for understanding from someone who was never able to give it in the first place. And in that moment, your emotional life becomes yours again, not shared, not controlled, not negotiated, yours. And that is where the real shift happens, not in what they do next, but in what no longer reaches you.